Welcome to today's Explainer. When we think about American expansion westward, the narrative we usually get is this smooth, inevitable march across the continent. President James K. Polk, he absolutely saw it that way. When the Mexican-American War kicked off, Washington literally envisioned a clean, easy takeover of the American West. They figured local populations would either, welcome them with open arms or just quietly step aside. But as we're going to see today, conquering a map on paper is a whole different ballgame than actually controlling the ground. What was supposed to be a straightforward campaign, it quickly devolved into a grueling, disorganized, and just deeply chaotic reality.
So let's dive right into this. The big question we're tackling today is, how exactly did a supposedly bloodless conquest turn into this chaotic clash of huge egos and ultimately deadly rebellions? It's really the great irony of the whole Western campaign. It started off miraculously easy, bloodless even. But that initial success, it created this incredibly dangerous illusion of control. And as we dig into the historical record, we'll see exactly how that illusion shattered, giving way to bitter infighting among American commanders and violent, desperate uprisings from the people who actually live there.
Part 1. A Bloodless Beginning. The March to Santa Fe.
Okay, so President Polk sends Colonel Stephen Kearny to secure New Mexico, which was a huge priority target. But doing that meant a march of 500 miles just to reach their rendezvous point at Ben's Fort. And let me tell you, this was not some casual stroll. We are talking about an agonizing trek across rough, completely arid terrain right in the dead of summer, starting all the way back at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. To make matters even worse, Kearny's men were mostly inexperienced volunteers. They were absolutely not used to marches like this. So by the time they arrived, they were exhausted, totally depleted, and honestly highly anxious about whatever was waiting for them in New Mexico.
And there was a massive disconnect between what they expected and reality. Reports were coming in that the Mexican governor, Manuel Armijo, had scraped together an army of about 2,000 men, firmly entrenched in defensive positions just north of Santa Fe. Kearny's exhausted guys were absolutely dreading a bloody fight against a numerically superior force. But when Armijo gathered his war council, he found out pretty quickly that his officers and his men had zero enthusiasm for fighting. They just did not care to lay down their lives for the Mexican government. So in this incredible historical anticlimax, Governor Armijo literally just disbanded his entire army on the spot and packed up for Chihuahua.
Just 2 days later, Kearny's forces rode right into Santa Fe to the sound of music and laughter, taking the capital without firing a single shot. Crazy, right? Kearny is quickly promoted to brigadier general and wastes no time asserting control. He sets up a temporary military government, appoints this prominent American merchant named Charles Bent as civilian governor, and leaves Colonel Sterling Price in charge of the military. Now, the absolute crucial point to remember here is that Kearny set up an entirely new government for a foreign territory despite having absolutely zero legal authority from Washington to do so. None. But practically speaking, his word was law out there. So, with New Mexico supposedly secured, Kearny packed up and took off for California.
Part 2. The California Uprising, an Illusion of Control. So, moving further west to California, that illusion of an easy American victory we just talked about, it was about to shatter completely. Back in August 1846, Commodore Robert Stockton and Captain John Frémont had prematurely declared total control of California. And just like Kearny did in New Mexico, they set up a civilian government without any real authority. But the locals, the Californios, they deeply resented their new occupiers. By September, that resentment just boiled over. A massive rebellion erupted in Los Angeles, led by José María Flores, and it was incredibly successful. By September 30th, the American commander on the ground, Captain Archibald Gillespie, was actually forced to surrender and hand over his heavy munitions. Fast forward to October, and the rebels had completely driven the Americans out. They controlled all of Southern California.
Now, Commodore Stockton, who is commanding the U.S. Pacific Squadron, decides he's going to just march right in and fix this whole mess. But here's the thing, naval rank does not translate to land logistics, not even close. Stockton sends a force of infantry to retake Los Angeles, but he completely fails to provision them properly. And even worse, he somehow didn't anticipate that the rebels were now fully armed with the exact same artillery they had just captured from Gillespie. So Stockton's poorly supplied men walked right into captured American artillery fire and were forced into a pretty humiliating retreat.
And it was right smack in the middle of this disaster that General Kearny finally arrives in California, having barely survived crossing the miserable desert with just 100 haggard men. He links up with the defeated Captain Gillespie, and together they spot an encampment of Californios under Captain Andres Pico at the village of San Pasqual. Now let's compare the forces here. Kearny's guys were exhausted, riding dying horses, and armed with close-range sabers. Pico's forces? They were well-rested, on fresh mounts, and wielding long-range lances. It's night and day. Yet, despite these overwhelming, glaring disadvantages, Kearny inexplicably orders a surprise attack. It was a crushing defeat. The American cavalry got completely decimated by the Lancers, leaving 18 Americans dead, and both Kearny and Gillespie seriously wounded.
Part 3. A clash of egos. Who is actually in charge?
With the rebellion in full swing, the Americans desperately needed a unified strategy. But instead they had Commodore Stockton, who claimed he was functionally in command on the ground, General Kearny, who actually held the official orders from the president, and Captain Frémont, this self-entitled freewheeling explorer who just loved flaunting orders. All three of these guys absolutely believed they were entitled to govern California. This massive, frustrating overlap in leadership meant that the American commanders were often fighting each other just as much as they were fighting the rebels.
This entire dysfunction really came to a head at the San Gabriel River. Kearny sensibly ordered the artillery to set up and provide some cover fire. But Stockton immediately countermands him, ordering the men to just rush across the river entirely exposed. I mean, it was incredibly risky. Fortunately, they actually made it across, and Stockton personally directed the artillery to destroy the Californian guns. The very next day, at the Battle of La Mesa, it honestly wasn't brilliant strategy. It was simply the superior range and power of the American artillery that won the day. That firepower forced the rebels to retreat, and finally allowed the Americans to recapture Los Angeles.
But hey, remember Captain Frémont, the explorer? Well, he was advancing from the north and actually intercepted the retreating rebels, including Captain Pico. Frémont decides entirely on his own to unilaterally negotiate an alternative to fighting. He drafts the Treaty of Cahuenga, which was this surprisingly generous treaty offering total amnesty. The rebels obviously gladly accepted it. The massive caveat here, Frémont had absolutely zero legal authority to negotiate or offer terms of any kind, especially since he was well within easy communication distance of his superior officers. It was literally the ultimate act of insubordination.
So as you can guess, both Kearny and Stockton were absolutely furious when they found out. They had to begrudgingly accept the peace, but the infighting? Oh, it definitely didn't stop. Stockton immediately declares himself governor and orders Frémont to support him. Kearny, really just wanting to avoid an outright mutiny at this point, backs down, but not before delivering a blisteringly sarcastic letter to Stockton. He wrote that he was, quote, leaving with you the great responsibility of doing that for which you have no authority and preventing me from complying with the president's orders. Wow. This bitter dispute was only finally settled when Washington sent reinforcements and crystal-clear orders confirming that Kearny was the true governor. Stockton got sent home, and Frémont was actually brought up on charges of mutiny.
Part 4. The violent reality, the Taos Revolt.
While the situation in California was finally being wrangled under control, the myth of a peaceful conquest back in New Mexico was violently shattered. Remember, the American takeover happened with zero consultation with the people who actually lived there. The large Hispano population and the Native American Puebloans, they had absolutely no say in joining the United States. And just because they didn't want to fight for Mexico didn't mean they passively accepted an American occupation. Landowners, Catholic priests, and the native Taos people deeply feared for their future, and that simmering resentment rapidly organized into organized resistance.
An initial plot was actually discovered in December, and the military commander, Colonel Price, figured he had handled it. But a bolder group of rebels, led by Pablo Montoya and Tomas Romero, struck in January. On January 19th, rebels broke into the home of the civilian governor we mentioned earlier, Charles Bent. In a truly brutal scene, they scalped him right in front of his family and killed him, along with a dozen other officials. The violence quickly spread to Arroyo Hondo, which prompted Colonel Price to gather hundreds of troops and march out to just absolutely crush the rebellion.
Price's forces tracked the remaining rebels all the way to the church of San Geronimo de Taos. For several days, American artillery just pelted the thick walls of the church until they finally blew a hole large enough to fire directly inside. The human cost here was completely devastating. 150 defending rebels were killed inside that church. It was a massacre that effectively broke the back of the resistance.
The suppression of the revolt following that was swift and it was brutal. First, the surviving leadership was captured, and you can really see the rawness of the tensions here because Tomas Romero was illegally shot and killed by an angry American soldier while he was sitting in custody. Shortly after that, Pablo Montoya and 14 other leaders were put on trial and formally executed under charges of treason.
And that brings us to a profound legal and moral dilemma. Think about it. Those rebel leaders were executed for treason against the United States. But remember what we established earlier? General Kearny had zero legal authority to set up that government in New Mexico to begin with. It wasn't even legally recognized by the U.S. yet. So I'm going to leave you with this question to chew on. How can you unlawfully resist an authority that did not have a lawful basis in the first place? It is a deeply messy, complicated reality that completely shatters the neat little textbook history of manifest destiny we're all taught. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the history you think you know.